Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Lennox Price. If you're listening to this, it means the houseboat is still floating on the lake and the world hasn't finished falling apart yet. I used to be an architect before the outbreak. I was the guy who drew clean lines for people with too much money. Glass walls over water, massive decks, soft lighting. Everything was designed to look peaceful from a distance. This boat started as one of those projects. It was supposed to be a showpiece for a client who wanted a weekend getaway, but he lost interest when the market dipped and never signed the final papers. The firm kept it. The keys sat in a box at the Marina office. For a long time, it was just another asset waiting for a buyer. That buyer never came. Something else did. When the first reports hit the news, the lake didn't look any different. You had your late-season tourists, a handful of fishermen, couples bickering on their decks. The word outbreak felt like a problem for the big cities and international airports. Not for a place with rental kayaks and a fried fish shack that closed at 9. So I kept working. I finished revisions on buildings that would never get built, telling myself that if the world was really ending, someone would make that clear. They didn't. The updates got strange, then short, then they just stopped. When everything finally tipped over, here is what I had. An apartment in town, a car with a quarter tank of gas, and the memory of one luxury houseboat tied up on the east side of the lake, fully furnished and barely touched. I knew that floor plan better than my own apartment. I knew where the generator sat, where the water lines ran, and exactly how much glass faced the shore. More importantly, I knew how easy it would be to see inside once the lights turned on. The last morning that felt anything close to normal started out dull and cold. The sky was the color of old parchment, that flat late-fall gray you get when the lake loses its shine and the season is basically dead. Down on the street, neighbors were already loading up station wagons with boxes from their cabins and awkwardly stacking lawn chairs on roofs. I watched them from my window, trying hard not to look at the muted TV in the corner. The ticker tape at the bottom kept scrolling the same word over and over: Outbreak. At first, the news stories were about places I'd never been to. We saw shaky cell phone videos coming out of crowded city hospitals, police barricades stretching across highways, and digital maps with red circles that just kept expanding. The news anchors used those practiced calm voices, assuring us that things were under control. Then the tone shifted. They stopped bringing doctors on live. Interviews got cut short mid-sentence. One afternoon, the screen just froze, jittered once, and cut to a blue government slide telling everyone to stay home, assist their neighbors, and wait for further instruction. Further instruction never came. The power flickered that evening and finally gave up just after midnight. By the next morning, my phone still showed a signal, but nothing would load. No data, no texts. Local radio had turned into a looped automated message about sheltering in place. Out in the stairwell of my building, people were filling the silence left by the lack of real information with pure fear. They were trading rumors about a brawl at the clinic, about someone biting a nurse, about an ambulance that had crashed off the bridge and hadn't been recovered. The proof finally arrived in the form of a short, ugly video clip from our own town that managed to load before the network died. Someone had climbed onto the roof of the grocery store and aimed their camera at the parking lot. Cars were abandoned at odd angles, doors hanging open like broken wings. People were sprinting between them, weaving through the lanes. But there were other figures moving slower, shambling like they were blackout drunk or badly injured. When the runners got too close, those slow shapes snapped rigid and lunged, grabbing with both hands. You couldn't make out the faces clearly, but the audio was crystal clear. You could hear the screams. The clip ended when the camera jerked sideways and the frame filled with empty gray sky. That was enough to make my apartment feel like a trap. It had floor-to-ceiling windows facing the street and a shared stairwell that echoed every sound. If the wrong kind of crowd moved through the neighborhood, there was nowhere to go except up, and the roof was a dead end. The lake, at least, offered open space and fewer directions for trouble to approach from. And on that lake, there was one structure I knew better than any other. The luxury houseboat I'd designed for a client who never showed up to claim it. Moving gave my hands something to do besides shake. I packed non-perishables, food that didn't need a fire or a microwave. I filled every bottle and pitcher I owned while the taps still had pressure. I grabbed a compact toolbox, a heavy winter coat, and my old broken-in hiking boots. The floor plans and scale models stayed on the desk. They didn't matter anymore. When I stepped into the hall, a neighbor stared at my duffel bag and asked where the hell I thought I was going. I told her simply, "Down to the Marina." She let out a sharp, cynical laugh and said, "You think the water cares about any of this?" I looked at her and said, "I think there are fewer people on it," and I kept moving. Driving to the lake was already a lost cause by the time I reached my car. The main road was gridlocked with vehicles pointed in every possible direction. Some doors were left open where drivers had just bailed out. A sedan sat idling nearby with no one behind the wheel. Further up, a delivery truck had tried to force its way through the median and ended up jackknifed across both lanes. I didn't even hesitate. I turned my car around, ditched it in an alley, left the keys on the driver's seat, and walked away. Owning the car was a lot less important than not being trapped inside it like a steel coffin. I stuck to the side streets to cover the rest of the distance. The closer I got to the water, the thinner the sounds of the town became. There was no music thumping from the bars, no kids riding bikes in circles, no steady hum of traffic. Just the wind and the occasional shout that cut off too abruptly to be anything good. When I reached the small hill that overlooked both marinas, the difference between them was stark. The public docks on the west side were a chaotic mess of motion. The private slips on the east side sat mostly still, almost peaceful. Everyone knew the West Marina. It had the rentals, the fuel dock, the big paved lot. That's where the panic went. That's where people ran when they decided boats were safer than houses. I could see them fighting over keys, arguing over space, trying to cram too many bodies onto anything that looked like it would float. I had zero intention of walking into that meat grinder. The East Marina was different. Smaller lots, coated gates, and an office where I knew exactly which key ring belonged to the empty houseboat waiting at the far end of the pier. Up close, the East Marina looked like everyone had left in a hurry. The office door stood slightly ajar. A glass pane in the front window was cracked, held together only by the tint film. A sandwich board that usually advertised fresh bait and hot coffee lay face down on the pavement, one hinge snapped off. No one was shouting. No one was smoking on the bench by the door. The wind slapped an empty flag rope against its metal pole with a soft, rhythmic clack. Inside, the gray daylight filtering through the windows was enough to see by. The air smelled like stale coffee and old dust. A small radio on the counter hissed with static. Every now and then, a voice would punch through the white noise, saying something about roadblocks or emergency shelters, but it never lasted long enough to catch the details. A landline phone rang once, shrill and loud, then stopped dead. Whoever was on the other end couldn't help me. I definitely couldn't help them. That was the first blunt, hard rule I let myself say out loud. The keyboard hung behind the desk exactly where I remembered it. Most of the hooks were empty, stripped bare by owners who had already come and gone, but one tag was still there, waiting with a pair of untouched keys. The tag had the name of a man who never spent a single night on the boat. I snatched the keys from the hook, closing my hand around them tight enough to dig the metal into my palm, and walked out of the office. The radio behind me was still hissing about safety protocols and patience. None of that noise would matter if I stayed on land and waited for help that wasn't coming. The East Pier was dead quiet. A few small cruisers rocked gently in their berths, but there wasn't a soul moving on the walkways. Across the water, though, the public marina was boiling over with noise. People were yelling, horns were blaring, engines were revving hard and then stalling out. It sounded like 100 desperate plans failing all at once. I didn't look. I kept my eyes locked on the last slip. The houseboat was waiting there, tied off with fresh, bright white rope, 2 levels of pristine white panels, long tinted windows, a wide roof deck with a polished metal rail. It looked exactly like the renderings I'd sent the client. It was built to show off wealth when the world was normal. Now, I needed to make it disappear. The gangway flexed under my boots when I stepped onto it. At the door, I paused and just listened. No voices, no heavy footsteps inside. Just the slap of waves against the fiberglass hull and the wind clanging a loose halyard against a mast nearby. The key turned cleanly in the lock. The click of the latch sounded dangerously sharp in the quiet, so I slipped inside fast and shoved the door shut with my shoulder. Inside, it smelled like new furniture and sawdust. The staging was untouched. White sofa, glass coffee table, spotless kitchen, folded towels, a fake fruit bowl, 2 bottles of sparkling water lined up perfectly on the counter. No coats, no shoes, no trash. It was a model home floating on water. I swept the place, sticking to a pattern, stand in the doorway, hold my breath, listen, then check the corners and under the surfaces. Salon, galley, bathroom, lower cabin, storage, mechanical room, roof stairs. All of it was empty. No duffel bags, no open hatches, no sign that anyone else had chosen this place as their life raft. I locked the door again and slid the deadbolt home with a heavy thud. Then I stood in the middle of the salon and tried to see the place from the shore's perspective. The main cabin was basically one long strip of glass. At night, a single light inside would turn this boat into a glowing lantern on the water. Anyone scared, sick, or angry would spot it from a mile away. Light and noise pull people in when they have nothing else to follow. My first job was to shut both of them down. Curtains hung on tracks along the windows, but they were light and gauzy, more for aesthetics than actual privacy. I pulled them closed and watched the room dim, then stepped back out onto the pier to check my work. From there, the glass still showed a soft, inviting gray glow. Not good enough. Back inside, I went hunting for anything dark and heavy. Under the stairs, I scavenged 2 rolls of painter's drop cloth and a half-used box of heavy-duty tape. I cut the cloth into rough panels, taped them directly to the inside of the windows, and pulled the curtains back over them. From the pier, the glass now looked flat and dead black. No glow, no moving shapes, just dull strips between white walls. The smaller windows near the galley faced the parking lot. Those got extra attention. I taped cloth over the glass, then stacked seat cushions and a folded mattress along the lower edge. If I slipped with a flashlight at night, the beam would die on the fabric instead of announcing my position to anyone looking down from the road. The roof deck came next. Up there, the wind had a harder bite. 2 lounge chairs sat strapped to the rail, pointed optimistically at the lake. A small table with a battery-operated fake candle waited between them. I unbuckled the straps, folded the chairs, and hauled them below. The table followed. Anything that looked like spare comfort or luxury needed to be out of sight. On the dock, a storage box held some Marina gear. 2 faded blue tarps, some frayed rope, spare fenders. I dragged the tarps up to the roof and draped them over sections of the shiny rail, tying them off so they sagged a little. It broke up the clean architectural lines and dulled the gleam of the metal. From the shore, the boat would look less like a perfect rectangle and more like something with junk stored on top. Neglected, maybe already looted. Back inside, I listened to how the boat moved in the water. A strip of trim near the sliding door buzzed every time the hull rocked. I pried it up, shoved a folded napkin under the edge, and screwed it back down tight. A cabinet latch clicked on every wave until I wrapped the metal loop in tape. Every loose piece I found went on a mental list. Fix it now, not later. By late afternoon, I had 3 rules written on the back of a glossy sales brochure. Rule 1, no lights near glass after dark. Any lamp stays low and away from windows pointed at a wall or the floor. Rule 2, no clear silhouettes. No pacing in front of windows, no standing tall on the roof, no waving at passing boats. Rule 3, no loud work at night. If something needs hammering or cutting and the boat is still floating, it waits for daylight and background noise. With those rules in place, the boat felt less like a display piece and more like a shell I could actually control. The galley held a few cans and dry goods meant for weekend guests, enough to stretch with what I'd carried in. The fresh water tanks were full. The generator gauge showed plenty of fuel. Outside, the light faded fast. Shouting from the public marina drifted across the water in broken, jagged pieces. An engine screamed at high RPMs and then died abruptly. Somewhere on the far shore, a siren rose once, wailed, and went quiet. When the dark finally settled, I kept the cabin lights off. I used one small battery lantern on the table, shaded by a metal mixing bowl, to direct the light down. The room stayed mostly in deep shadow. The hull creaked against the fenders. Water tapped the fiberglass sides in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. From the shore, this houseboat was just another dark, lifeless shape at the far end of a quiet dock. That was enough for the first night. Surviving whatever came next would start with staying invisible right here. Late fall on the lake doesn't give you much of a grace period. The water temperature drops fast, the wind funnels down the valley with a harder edge, and every mistake you make costs you body heat. Out here, the walls are just a few thin layers of fiberglass paneling and foam insulation, and the floor has freezing water sitting right on the other side of it. This houseboat was built for summer cocktails and long weekends, not for grinding out a survival situation in bad weather. When the wind picked up, it slid right under the hull and sucked the warmth out from beneath my feet. The first morning, I woke up seeing my own breath hanging in the salon air, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the match to light the stove. Comfort stopped being the goal pretty damn quick. The job was simple now. Keep the boat livable enough that I could think straight. Heat, water, food, power, noise. If one of those slipped, the rest got a hell of a lot harder. The boat had a small diesel heater vented through the side hull. I dug the manual out of a junk drawer, primed the fuel line, bled the air out, and held the ignition button until the burner finally caught with a whoosh. A low, steady hum filled the cabin and warm air started creeping out of the floor vents. But outside, the exhaust pipe was sending a thin thread of gray smoke drifting over the lake. Smoke meant attention. Smoke was a signal fire. That wasn't going to work at night when people on shore were staring at distant shapes trying to decide if they were worth rowing toward. The heater became strictly a daytime tool, a short burn in the morning to take the edge off, another in the late afternoon, and never after dark unless it was a choice between using it and losing my fingers to frostbite. Water came next. The main tanks under the salon floor were full, but I treated them like a savings account I was terrified to touch. Boiling lake water worked, but propane was limited, so I set up a cruder system. A narrow swim platform at the stern sat low enough that I could scoop water without leaning out too far and exposing myself. I'd brace a knee against the transom, dip a bucket, and haul it inside. On the galley counter, I poured the murk through a folded cloth into a pot to catch the worst of the sediment and algae, then ran it through a small hiking filter into plastic jugs. It wasn't pretty, but it was wet. Food was a different kind of problem. The marina stockroom, the office vending machine, and what I'd grabbed from my apartment gave me a head start, not a sustainability plan. Cans of soup, rice, pasta, some dried fruit, all of it meant for weekend snacking, not a slow societal collapse. Still, the lake had fish. I found 2 basic spinning rods in the dock locker, checked the monofilament for rot, and tied on simple hooks. Fishing from the roof deck would have made me a perfect silhouette against the sky, so I stayed low. I sat on the stern with my back pressed against the transom, dropping a line into the deep shadow of the hull. Catching anything took patience and quiet hands. No radio, no talking to myself. Just a slow mental count and a soft lift of the rod tip when I felt a tap. When a fish came up, usually a bass or a perch, I worked fast to keep it from flopping and slapping the deck. A towel went under it immediately, then a knife for a quick, quiet end, and straight into a pan. Storage turned into a game of Tetris. The boat had plenty of space, but most of it was designed for vacation clutter. Empty cupboards over the sink, drawers filled with branded napkins, bins holding spare sheets. One by one, I cleared them out and moved the critical items to within 3 steps of where I slept. Heavy things sat low and close to the center line so the boat wouldn't list. Dry food in sealed plastic containers, water jugs strapped in place with bungee cords, tools in a crate with a latching lid. Anything that could roll got a box. Anything that could rattle got wrapped in cloth. Power was a worry that sat constantly in the back of my head. The houseboat had a small generator and a bank of marine batteries. The solar panels on the roof were mostly for show, trickle chargers, but they still pulled a little juice. I flipped the main breakers off, then brought circuits back on one at a time until I knew exactly what each switch fed. Lights stayed off unless I was working on something that absolutely couldn't wait. I lived by a battery lantern and a headlamp with a red lens. My phone and the crank radio shared what little power I could spare. The cold seeped through every crack, so I chased it wherever I could. Rugs from the bedroom got dragged into the salon and laid over the bare floor. Towels were stuffed into the gaps under the doors. A spare heavy blanket draped over the inside of the main hatch cut down on the drafts. Filling a bucket too fast made the handle bang against the hull. Dropping a pan turned into a major event that made my heart hammer. I forced myself to slow down. I treated every action, every movement as something the lake could hear. The days blurred into a gray pattern. I checked the ropes, the fenders, and every latch I relied on to keep the window covers tight. When the last light finally faded from the western shore, the houseboat sat in shadow, quiet and dull. From the outside, that was the entire point. I wanted passing boats, if any were actually left, to see just another unused structure riding out the off-season. Nothing worth boarding, nothing worth breaking into. Anybody who came close enough to check would be making a deliberate choice, and I decided then and there that I would treat that choice as a threat by default. The first few days on the boat passed with more silence than actual action. Occasionally, I'd hear a shout or the distant metallic bang of something hitting a dumpster across the water, but nothing came close to the East Marina. The public docks on the other side were boiling with noise and panic. This side stayed dead still. That changed the first time I saw one of them up close. The midday light was sitting flat and gray on the lake. The air was cold enough that my breath smoked in front of my face when I stepped out to check the lines. I stayed low, crouching along the side of the houseboat, checking the cleats with one hand while I scanned the shore through a gap between the blue tarps and the rail. The parking lot above the slips looked abandoned. Cars sat in crooked rows, doors shut, windows fogged up with condensation. Then a figure stepped out from between two parked trucks. He moved wrong from the very first step. His head was pointed down like he was fascinated by his own shoes, but his shoulders hung completely limp. Each leg swung out too far, hit the asphalt hard, and then dragged before he could trigger the next step. No coat, just a thin dress shirt, bare hands turning blue. No one walks around a lake lot dressed like that in late November unless something inside their head has already given up. I watched him from the deep shadow of the upper deck until he reached the top of the wooden ramp that led down toward my pier. For a second, I told myself he might turn and follow the road along the shore instead. He never even glanced that way. His head snapped toward the water and stopped, like the lake made a sound only he could hear. His feet started shuffling down the ramp. The wood planks gave a hollow, rhythmic thud under his weight, one slow foot at a time. He didn't pause to check his balance or look for a handrail. He just followed the ramp until he reached the main walkway and stopped dead again. I pulled my head back from the gap and pressed my shoulder hard against the cabin wall. Suddenly, the houseboat felt too bright, too white, too clean, even with the windows covered. My brain started flipping through every potential mistake I might have left behind. A bit of metal rigging that still rattled in the wind, a loose fender that squeaked against the hull. Steps came closer, a slow, uneven beat on the dock. When I eased one eye back to the gap in the tarp, he was standing 2 slips away, staring down at the dark, oily water between the pilings. There was no special noise down there, just the slap of water against fiberglass and the groan of ropes. Still, something held his attention. Slowly, he turned his head toward my slip. His face didn't change expression. His mouth hung a little open, slack and wet. His body followed his head and his feet lined up with the narrow strip of dock that led straight toward my bow. Running inside and slamming a door would have been worse than standing still. Any sharp sound would carry like a gunshot. I slid one boot back until my heel touched the rim of the roof hatch, ready to drop below if the wood groaned under me. He walked to the end of the dock and stopped at the bow of the boat in the slip right next to mine. Up close, I could see mud caked on his dress pants and a dark, dried streak along one forearm that was almost certainly someone else's blood. He just stared at the curve of the hull. Then he stepped off the dock. It wasn't a jump. He didn't brace himself. He simply walked forward like he expected more wood under his foot, put his weight down, and let gravity take him. For a moment, his arms swung wide in a clumsy arc, and then he hit the water with a flat, heavy splash. The surface closed over his head instantly. Bubbles rolled up and popped against the hull. Seconds stretched out. I counted without wanting to. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. On 6, his hand came up, slapped weakly against the side of the boat, and slid back down. His head surfaced next, turned blindly toward the dock, and then drifted away as the slow, cold pull of the lake caught his body. There was no kicking, no thrashing, no effort to swim. He bumped against the pilings once with a soft thud, turned in the small current between the slips, and eased into the gap. The last thing I saw was the back of his head sliding past, hair plastered flat to his skull, mouth still hanging open, drifting like a log. By late afternoon, a small aluminum boat pushed off from the far shore. 2 people sat in it, both bundled in heavy jackets, both rowing in short, hard strokes that sent the bow cutting across the chop. They were headed straight toward the East Marina, toward the same ramps and walkways I had been counting on staying empty. I watched them through a narrow gap near the stern, keeping my face well back from the glass. From their angle, my houseboat was just another white box at the end of the line. I needed it to stay that way. They reached the outer posts, and the man grabbed one with a boat hook. The woman in the bow looked exhausted enough to fall over right where she sat. The man in the stern pointed toward the slips. She shook her head once, sharp and fearful, and stayed seated. He tied them off, climbed onto the dock, and started walking toward the ramp I had watched earlier. Halfway up, he stopped. He stared at the wet marks on the boards where the walker had passed, then looked down into the water between the boats. Whatever he saw changed his posture instantly. His shoulders tightened and his head snapped up. He called back toward the skiff, louder this time. Even across the water, I could hear the words clear and strained. He said there was one in the water, and told her to stay in the boat and keep her hands on the oar. Those were sensible instructions. They were also louder than I liked. Sound carries over flat water like it's on a wire. If more of the infected were wandering the lots above, that shout was an invitation to dinner. I couldn't warn him without giving away my own position. I stayed still and listened, waiting to see if the lake answered back. Nothing moved at first, but the quiet felt thin like ice about to crack. 2 days after I watched the man step off the dock like there was more wood under his foot and vanish between the hulls, the sound on the lake changed. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of small outboards or the scattered shouting from the far marina anymore. While I was checking the tape on a window cover, a low, steady vibration started coming through the floorboards, a deep engine note that didn't rise or fall but held one heavy, rhythmic tone. I turned off the heater, set the lantern in the sink so it wouldn't slide if we rocked, and climbed up to the roof hatch. I moved the blanket aside just enough to let the cold air hit my face. The tarps I had tied along the rail left narrow gaps where I could look out without showing much of myself. Through one of those gaps, I saw a long, dark shape pushing up the center of the lake. It was throwing a clean white wake as it came closer. Soon I could make out twin pontoons under a wide metal deck, a square cabin on one side, and rows of drums and plastic crates strapped along the other. 3 men moved between the cargo like they knew every corner by heart. It was a work barge turned into a patrol boat, not a family trying to escape. They cut the throttle as they passed the noisy public docks and drifted toward our quiet side. A man near the cabin roof picked up a handheld loudspeaker, pressed it close to his mouth, and said, "Attention on the water. We are a private security firm contracted by the county. We are coordinating safety and resource management on the lake effective immediately. His voice was clear and steady, cutting through the wind. He continued, "All remaining vessels are required to prepare for inspection and registration. Cooperation ensures protection." People on the far shore yelled questions and demands, but their voices blended into one long, angry sound aimed at the only boat that still moved like it had fuel, guns, and a schedule. I lay flat on the roof and listened while he promised controlled fuel distribution and guarded anchorages. Then he added, "There will be firm consequences for anyone who refuses to cooperate with the stabilization effort." He shifted into talking about assets and zones in a way that made it clear he thought the water and everything on it already belonged to him. When the shouting from the public marina rose high enough, he turned back to the speaker and said, "We will begin clearance on the west bank. Weak vessels will be removed. Anyone with spare fuel or weapons must declare them immediately. Hiding resources is now a security issue." He pointed toward our pier and said something to the man at the wheel. The barge began to slide toward the line of slips where I was hiding. I dropped back through the hatch, pulled the blanket into place, and walked the cabin once to make sure every curtain was tight and every strip of cloth still held. Then I crouched by a narrow crack near the galley window where the tape hadn't quite met the frame. Just enough space to see the dock outside without putting my face against the glass. The barge bumped against the outer pilings with a heavy thud. One of the men hopped off with a line and made it fast, and then 3 of them stepped onto our pier. They had the balanced walk of people who spend more time on decks than on sidewalks. The lead man was the one with the loudspeaker. He wore a dark jacket with an old company logo, a radio clipped to his collar, and a sidearm on his hip. He put one hand on the nearest hull, leaned in, and said, "This is Lake Security conducting safety checks. Step out and identify yourselves to help keep the lake civilized." When no one answered from the first slips, where a small sailboat and a mildew-streaked cruiser had sat empty since I arrived, he made quick notes on a pad. He read off the hull numbers, looked at the man behind him, and said, "Mark them as low priority and salvageable." Then he moved on without raising his voice. At the third slip, a tired voice answered from inside the cabin. I listened while the lead man repeated his offer in a shortened form. He said, "We're offering registration under our watch. Fuel is handled by us, night watches are shared. In exchange, we keep the bad off the water." The owner hesitated, then admitted he had a spare fuel can and no real plan now that the town was gone. A minute later, that can was sitting on the deck of the barge. The lead man nodded at the owner and said, "Consider that an investment in stability." He stepped to the next boat, working down the pier in the same pattern. Knock, announce, question, record, take what they could use. A fourth man stayed on the barge with a rifle in his hands, watching the shoreline and the gaps between the buildings like he expected someone on land to get brave or stupid. My houseboat sat at the far end, right next to a small runabout that hadn't moved since everything fell apart. When the lead man reached that runabout, he rapped his knuckles on the windshield frame, looked inside, and told his partner, "Empty." Then he lifted his head and focused on my slip. Even with the dust and the tarps, the shape still read clearly, more volume and cleaner lines than most boats here. He walked along my hull, running his hand over one of the mooring lines like he was judging how recently it had been adjusted. He said quietly to the man behind him, "This one is maintained. Either someone is on it, or someone plans to be." His partner asked, "Is that a problem?" The lead man answered, "Depends if they want to be part of the system or a loose piece we have to deal with later." He stepped closer, put his palm flat on the side of the houseboat, and knocked hard enough that the sound vibrated through the panels and into my chest. He raised his voice just enough to carry through the cabin and said, "Houseboat at the end of the pier. This is Lake Security. If you're aboard, now is the time to talk and register." Every old reflex I had screamed at me to answer and open the door. It's hard to stay silent when authority knocks, but I stayed frozen where I was and let the silence stand in for an answer. I knew that once I stepped into his system, the boat stopped being a shelter and turned into inventory. Hollis Dray showed up on a gray, heavy afternoon when the lake looked flat as polished slate and the wind kept the hull in a slow, rhythmic sway. I was in the stern, cutting a strip of rubber to quiet a pump rattle, when metal scraped along the starboard corner. It was a hard drag on the fiberglass that shoved my wrench box across the deck and ended in a soft bump as another hull settled against mine and stayed put. I set the knife down slowly, moved to the side window and lifted the edge of the taped cloth just enough to see. A narrow aluminum skiff was rocking in the gap. A man was kneeling in the middle of it, one hand on the gunwale to steady himself and the other raised in a small, non-threatening wave. He looked up at the covered glass and said, "Sorry for the hit. I was hoping you weren't the kind of neighbor who opens with a shot." He was close enough that I could see the pale marks where safety glasses had lived on his face for weeks, and the dark, patchy stubble along his jaw. His jacket was a security fleece from the Barge, but the logo had been scratched almost flat with a knife. A cheap orange life vest sat crooked over it, one broken buckle tied off with a piece of fraying cord. There was no extra gear in sight, no spare fuel cans, no second person hiding under a tarp. I let that picture sit for a moment, evaluating the threat. Then I slid the window open a hand's width and said, "Hold there, a few feet out, and keep your hands where I can see them." He eased the skiff back with a short practice stroke of the paddle and answered, "Hands are up. I just want to talk before the lake or my old crew decide for me." I kept my voice low and asked, "How did you find this slip when everyone else is still clawing at the public docks?" He shifted his weight, keeping his balance easily, and said, "I used to ride the big barge. Board crew talk on open mics is a gold mine. I heard more than once about a white houseboat at the rich end that never turned on lights or answered knocks." He glanced back toward the open water and added, "That silence made my boss nervous." His empty hand stayed away from his pockets, fingers spread wide. His eyes moved enough to check the pier and the shoreline without losing contact with the window. When he paused, he said, "If you're going to tell me to get lost, I'd rather hear it now than when a patrol catches us yelling and decides we're both a problem." I stared at him and said, "What do you want badly enough to bring their skiff into a dead-end slip they still think they own?" He looked down at the water once, then back up at me and said, "I want off their deck before they make me clear another family off a dock just because their boat has more fuel than ours. I want to stand somewhere they don't talk about people like their cargo." He took a breath and added, "I don't expect mercy. I just want one straight shot at explaining myself. But if I have to shout this from the water, the sound will pull the barge down here faster than either of us can think." For a second, the only sound was the skiff knocking softly against my hull. Stories like that can be bait, a sob story to get the door open. So I watched his face and hands for the tells that show when someone is reciting a script instead of remembering pain. His eyes didn't jump when I pushed on details. His shoulders didn't tighten when he talked about leaving. His hand on the gunwale stayed loose instead of curling toward where a weapon might sit. When nothing twitched the wrong way, I said, "You can come alongside and tie off, but anything sharp or heavy stays on the rail before you touch this deck." He nodded once and said, "Fair." He used the short paddle to ease the skiff against the swim platform, looped his line around the stern cleat, and waited with both hands resting on the metal until I told him to move. At the platform, I kept the main door mostly closed and spoke through the gap at the latch. I said, "Put the knife, the multi-tool, and whatever else you're carrying on the rail, then take 2 steps back." A folding knife, a heavy multi-tool, and a beat-up compact pistol came out of his pockets and tapped against the metal in that order. Only then did he look up and say, "Name's Hollis Dray." I ran nights for lake security until I understood what that really meant. I looked at the pile of metal and asked, "What does it mean now?" He answered, "It means they started out guarding county fuel and ended up taking whatever they wanted off any hull that couldn't push back. And they liked it more every week." I opened the door just wide enough for him to slip through and said, "Come in, don't touch anything until I tell you where to stand." He stepped across the threshold, looked once at the taped windows and the stripped-down furniture and said, "You've done a hell of a lot of work to make this place look dead from the pier." I pointed to a clear patch of floor by the table and said, "There, back to the wall. Hands where I can see them." He did as told and waited while I listened to the hull and the wind, trying to decide if one more person in this box made it safer or just louder. After a minute, I lowered my guard slightly and I said, "If you stay, you live under our rules. We keep sound small, light low, and guns as the last answer, not the first. And nobody brings barge trouble down here on purpose." Hollis nodded slowly and said, "Sounds like the first sane offer I've had in weeks." He looked around the dim cabin and added, "You let me sleep where the roof doesn't leak, and I'll pay rent in information and work. I know their routes, their lazy days, and which of them cuts corners when they think nobody's listening." I watched him carefully and said, "That starts to earn your place. But if you call them here with your mouth or your mistakes, you won't get a second talk." He held my eyes for a long second and said, "Deal." He said it like a man who knew that staying unseen on this lake would take a lot more than just one good story in a stolen skiff. By the time Maris Calloway showed up, the lake had already pushed out most of the casual traffic. Anyone still moving on the water either had a rock-solid plan or had simply run out of better places to go to die. That afternoon, the sky sat low and bruised over the water. Hollis was up on the roof with the binoculars while I was below trying to fix a sticky locker latch. He tapped the rail twice, our signal for look, not panic, and called down, "Single kayak, hugging the north point, riding the shadows close to the rock." From the galley window, I watched the kayak until it cleared a line of submerged stumps. It was close enough that I could see a faded orange hull with a black spray skirt and 2 waterproof dry bags strapped behind the cockpit. I saw the woman in it wearing a dark cap pulled low. Every stroke she took was short and shallow, just enough to keep her moving along the shoreline without throwing bright, splashing blades into the open water. She knew how to move without being seen. She drew level with the private slips without turning toward the public marina or crossing the line the barge usually carved down the center of the lake. When her bow lined up perfectly with our end of the pier, it told me she had either been watching us from somewhere high up, or she was willing to walk into a blind spot on purpose. I slid the side window open just enough for my voice to carry and said, "Hold there, don't tie off." She flinched slightly at the sound, turned her head toward the houseboat and set both palms flat on the cockpit rim. She called back, "I know someone's living on that white boat at the end. I'm not here to claim it. I just want to talk while I can still see you, not after the barge comes back and starts guessing for me." Her voice was steady, but the way she kept her knees braced against the hull and the paddle resting ready across her lap told me she was prepared to back paddle hard if we gave her the wrong answer. I kept my tone flat and asked, "How are you so sure this boat isn't just staged and empty? We've done everything we can to make it look dead from the shore and from the water." She tipped her chin toward our hull and said, "Your fenders move." She paused, then added, "From the bluff above the old campground, I've watched your bow ride high some days and low on others. Your lines keep changing. And I've seen your roof watch scan the lake twice. I know that scan pattern because I've done similar work." Hollis stepped up to the edge where she could see his shoulders over the rail and said, "Then quit pretending you don't know who I am." She looked up at him, squinting against the gray light, and answered, "Maris Calloway, no current employer." She drifted a few inches closer and added, "I used to pull private security on the South Shore for houses with floating toys bigger than this one, until the owners flew out one morning and never came back." She let the kayak drift in the small current and said, "After that, my supervisor pointed at the barge and called it the future. He told anyone who wanted fuel and guns to get on board. He told the rest of us we were free to walk home through the woods and find out how far the sickness had spread." She looked down at her hands and said, "I picked the trees. I lost good people on that walk. I ended up working out of a broken boathouse with just this kayak and a clipped police scanner." I watched her breathing settle. She wasn't begging. She was reporting. I said, "If I let you come closer, you follow our rules from the first step. No yelling on the pier, no light near glass after dark, and no reaching for metal unless something is already breaking." I leaned closer to the mesh and added, "Because this place only works if it stays quiet from every angle that isn't this window." She nodded once, dipped the paddle with a slow, silent stroke to slide closer, and said, "Rules I can live with. I've done worse under people I trusted less." She looked up at me and added, "You give me a dry bunk and a door that opens when I push it, and I'll pay my way with what I know about their habits and the parts of this lake they don't bother to watch." We tied her kayak to a side cleat where it wouldn't bang against the hull. When she stepped onto the swim platform, she moved like someone who knew exactly how much weight to put on wet plastic and when to pause for balance. She looked up at the open side door and said, "If you're going to search me, do it now while I'm still freezing, not after you get used to having another set of hands." I told her, "Step inside, stop by the table, keep your pack where I can see it." She did as she was told. Her eyes moved over the taped windows and the stripped furniture, taking it all in. She said, "You stripped the pretty off this place on purpose. This looks planned, not lucky. I can live with planned a lot more than I can live with pretending the barge cares about us." Hollis stood by the door and went through the rules again in the same even tone I had once used with him. He said, "No lights against bare glass after dark, no raised voices outside the hull, no hiding injuries or fevers, and no grabbing for guns unless something is already trying to get through a wall." He crossed his arms and added, "If you worked anywhere near that barge, you owe us everything you know about its roots, its lazy habits, and which of those men will make bad calls when they're scared." Maris rubbed her hands together to bring some feeling back into them and said, "You get all that, and you get one more thing you don't have yet." She looked at the map spread out on the table and added, "2 nights ago, the barge started running with a second boat, a small skiff with a strong forward light and a woman named Nerissa Vaughn on the tiller." She looked at Hollis and said, "She likes to work the private slips after the main loop. She comes in quiet, sweeping with that lamp until something doesn't fit her idea of an empty dock." When she said the full name, Hollis leaned his shoulder hard into the wall. He said, "I know that family. She's not the kind you send out to burn fuel for fun." He looked at me and added, "If Vaughn is on the water, they've decided the easy days are over. They think the blank corners on their map need attention. And this pier is one of those corners whether we like it or not." We cleared a space in the forward cabin. I pointed to the bed and said, "That bunk is yours for now. Your pack stays where we can see it from the hall, and you sleep with the door unlatched until we're sure we all hear trouble the same way." She answered, "Fine by me. I prefer doors that open fast anyway." She set her gear down and promised that in the morning she would sketch the lake as she had seen it from the bluff and from her broken boathouse. She said she'd mark the patrol lines, the quiet inlets, and the bad stretches of shore in pencil so we could stop guessing where their eyes would go next. A dry bunk and simple rules for her. Better maps and one more steady set of eyes for us. On this lake, that passed for a fair trade. Pressure from lake security built slowly, like someone kept adding weight to the hull one sandbag at a time. By the time we finally acknowledged it out loud, the barge engine already had a rhythm we could feel vibrating in our teeth at night. Every few days, that low, heavy note came grinding down the middle of the lake on almost the exact same line. The searchlight paused a little longer over the private piers, and the same voices carried over the water when the wind turned right. Our houseboat at the end of the east pier had stopped being just another dark shape. It had become a quiet spot that stayed quiet too long, and people who crave control always noticed the silence. We couldn't control them, so we controlled what they saw. I let a band of brown grime build up at the waterline instead of polishing it off. Hollis dragged a cracked dock box from an empty slip, tipped it on its side near our bow, and said it made us look broke instead of careful. We purposely let one fender ride low so it squeaked on rough days and left an old frayed line coiled sloppily on the boards. From the channel, the end of the pier now read as clutter and neglect. Inside, the discipline was tighter. We strapped crates to the bulkheads so nothing would shift. We walked the floor in thick socks until our feet knew every quiet board. We pushed the chairs away from the windows so no one would pace in front of the glass by habit when nerves got bad. The first time we saw Nerissa Vaughn's skiff, the lake had gone from steel gray to almost oily black. The public marina across the water was just a darker knot of noise and confusion. 2 taps on the ceiling, then a third meant, "Look now," so I shaded the lantern and climbed quietly through the roof hatch. Through a narrow gap at the rail, I saw a small hull sliding along the private slips. Its bow light was hooded, and the outboard was barely purring above idle. One person stood at the tiller with a handheld lamp, keeping the beam low on the pilings and dock boards. Maris watched for a few seconds and whispered, "That's Nerissa. She ran detail routes for my old boss. If she's this far over, they're done treating this side of the lake like background noise." The skiff eased between 2 empty slips and drifted toward our pier. The lamp paused on an old runabout with a fogged windshield, walked along the bow, and then rested on the tipped dock box Hollis had planted near our bow. The beam stayed there for a slow count and then clicked off. She let the boat rock in the silence and listened. When she finally spoke, her voice came across the water as a flat conversational strip. She didn't shout, she just projected. "If you're sitting in there in the dark, you already know this lake is smaller than it looks," she said. "Winter is close. Engines fail in the ice. Fuel goes bad. And the things on shore are learning that noise means food. You don't have to like us, but we're the ones still moving." Nothing in that speech was wrong. For a second, I felt my throat tighten with the urge to answer, to defend our position instead of letting her file us as another dead hull. Hollis set his hand firmly on the rail near mine and said quietly, "Don't. If she tags this pier as interesting, she comes back with more bodies and a brighter light. Give her no flicker, no scrape, and she gets bored." So we stayed quiet. I counted my breaths until the hammering in my chest slowed down. Nerissa let the silence sit for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then she clicked the lamp back on, swept the beam along our corner of the pier one last time, and said, "If you're hiding from us, that's your call. If you're hiding from shore, think hard about how many nights you can do that alone." The way she said alone sounded more like someone who had counted her own bad nights than a clean threat. But the choice remained simple. Answer, and be counted as an asset, or stay silent and hope to be filed under not worth the fuel. This time she let us be ghosts. "Low return," she said to herself, loud enough for us to hear. Then she turned the skiff away and gunned the engine, leaving a wake that rattled our plates. Back below, we sat at the table in the dark until Maris stared at the map drawer and said, "She'll mark this pier as quiet but not dead. They'll come back when they're bored or when the west side costs too much to patrol." I asked, "So we move?" Hollis shook his head. "Not yet. If we run without a push, we're just guessing." We pulled Maris's hand-drawn map from the drawer and spread it on the table, pinning the corners with heavy mugs. Pencil lines marked the patrol routes, wide loops for the barge and skinny, probing sweeps for the skiff. She tapped 3 small bays along the north shore and said, "These stay quiet most days. No good roads, bad ramps, lots of fallen trees. Good blinds, bad exits. We could tuck in there, but if they clear them, anyone inside has nowhere to go but straight through them." I pointed at the bays and said, "Option 1, stay here and lie low. Option 2, try a cove and trust their laziness." Hollis added, "Option 3, row to the barge and pretend we want in." Then he shook his head and said, "Which is basically picking who holds the gun to your head." In the end, we chose to stay, but we stopped treating staying like sitting still. We rigged the houseboat so leaving turned from an abstract idea into something we could do half asleep. Lines at the bow and stern sat in simple wraps instead of tight, complex marina knots. Sharp knives waited at the cleats. Loose gear shifted toward the center where it wouldn't slide if the hull swung hard. We walked through the drill until we could say it without thinking. On my word, Hollis would cut the bowline. I would kill the main breakers and Maris would work the stern and watch the gap. When we finished the last run-through, she nodded once and said, "If boots hit the dock fast, we don't stand here and argue, we move. We talk later." The night we almost lost the houseboat didn't start with anyone yelling for help. It started with the wind pushing harder along the hull while we walked the same anxious loop, trying to convince ourselves that the map on the table still held more than 3 bad options. Hollis went over the bow and stern lines again, running his bare hands along each rope and listening for new sharp pops in the nylon or the groan of the cleats. Maris sat by the stern glass with the scanner pressed tight to one ear, catching half-broken radio calls from places we couldn't see. I was cutting pieces of cardboard to pad a locker latch so it wouldn't rattle if we ever had to leave the slip fast. By midnight, the public marina had faded into a dull orange smear of light through the trees, and the sky dropped low enough that the pier posts seemed to disappear into the dark. The steady breeze turned into short, violent gusts that made the abandoned sailboats knock in their slips and shook hardware we thought we had already fixed. I lay on my bunk counting the rhythmic pull of the bowline with each wave. Then a different sound cut through the pattern, a single heavy footstep on the dock. It was too slow and too hard for anyone who knew how to walk on wet boards. The next step landed closer. The hull rolled under my shoulders. By the time the third step hit, I was already in the salon with my hand braced on the wall. Hollis stood in the dark and said, "That came all the way down the ramp." We killed the heater instantly and waited for our vision to catch up to the dark. Through a narrow gap at the stern, we saw the pale strip of the parking lot above the slips and the darker line of the pier below it. Something was moving along that line in broken jerks, pausing too long between steps, one hand scraping the metal rail as it felt its way forward. When the shape reached the end of the pier, it stopped near our bow. It leaned in until the fender squealed against the fiberglass. Then it slid out of sight with a flat, heavy splash that told us more than any view would have. The hull lurched as the weight dropped away into the water. The forward rope snapped tight with a twang like a bass string, and somewhere up front, tired metal complained loud enough to make all 3 of us stop breathing at the same time. While we listened to the strained creak of the bow line, another noise rolled in from the open water. It was a low engine note, thicker than any fishing motor and familiar enough that we didn't need to see the deck to know it was the barge. Maris lifted the scanner, listened to the static, and nodded toward the lake. Through the side glass, we saw their bow light push a hazy cone across the middle of the water, then swing toward the private slips instead of the louder public ramp. They were running slower than usual, lights low, moving like people who wanted to surprise whoever was still using this side of the water. The next gust of wind lined up perfectly with their wake. It hit the boats on our pier sideways and made everything lean harder. The strain on the bow line jumped from a background worry to a real, immediate question. Then the cleat answered for us. A short, sickening crack vibrated through the floor. The houseboat rolled farther than it had any right to. The forward rope slipped, and suddenly most of the weight holding our nose in the slip rested on rotting wood and a single stern line that had never been meant to carry that much tonnage. Hollis kept his voice low and said, "If that last one tears while they're level with us, we swing out into their light and sell the whole lie in one move." We had 3 choices and not much time. We could go out on the dock and try to throw a new line around hardware that had already warned us it was failing. With a body in the water somewhere near our bow and the wind trying to push us off the boards. We could stay and hope the stern rope held, trusting wood that had just told us exactly what it thought of our faith. Or we could cut the line on purpose, kill our own power, and let the lake slide us out of the slip while the barge engine covered whatever noise we made. None of those felt good, but letting the rope pick the moment felt worse than picking it ourselves. We had walked through the departure drill enough times that the steps were already lined up in our heads. Lights off, breakers off, bow loose, stern loose, Talk later," I whispered. "If the hull starts to creep away from the pier while the barge is closest, we treat that as the signal. We don't wait for a cleaner chance that might never come." Maris watched the wash of their bow light move along the line of boats and said, "I'll call it when they're loudest." Hollis stood by the stern hatch with the knife in his hand, and his shoulder pressed against the frame like he was already bracing against the pull. The next wake reached us as 3 slow, rolling lifts. On the second lift, the stern rope screamed across the cleat. On the third, it let go with a quick pop that sounded small but final. I hit the main breakers and felt every electronic hum in the cabin die at once. The silence was absolute inside. I tapped the wall twice for go. I heard Hollis slip through the hatch and lean out just far enough to make sure nothing still tied us to the pier. Without power, the houseboat felt lighter and less certain underfoot, as if the floor had forgotten which way was level. For a few heartbeats, we floated in place, our sides still brushing the slip out of habit. Then the slow pull of the lake took hold. The pier began to slide past the covered glass in short, disorienting jerks. The runabout that had always sat next to us came fully into view for the first time in weeks. Beyond it, the barge moved by at barely more than idle. Its bowlight reached over the slips, washing the now empty end of our pier in blinding white. One of the men on deck raised his arm. He glanced once at the empty space where our houseboat had been just seconds ago. He paused, then turned back toward the louder docks on the other side. He left us drifting in the dark, silent and untethered, waiting for the lake and their next move to decide what came next. If you enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're listening from. See you in the next one.